Okay, so we're moving on to 11.3. We're going to be talking in this section about energy sources for muscle use. And so I have to remind you, back in a previous chapter, we talked about how cells cannot use, carbohydrates, glucose, proteins, fats, fatty acids, or glycerol directly for energy. Instead, we have to convert the chemical energy found in those macronutrients into ATP first. And so ATP is going to be the energy source that our cells can use directly. Okay, so again, ATP, we've seen it before. When one of the phosphate groups of ATP, so the terminal phosphate group we call it, is cleaved off or removed from the end, the energy that was between those two phosphate groups in that bond is going to be released, and it can be used for the cell to do work, including muscle contractions. When we're talking about exercise, that's what we're talking about. And so ATP is going to be required for muscle contractions, so it's required for exercise. And so again, ATP, a constant supply of ATP is going to be needed. ATP is not stored in muscle cells, and so your muscle cells are going to have enough ATP around for probably 1 to 2 seconds of activity, but ATP has to constantly be generated in order for muscles to continue to move. Again, ATP is an unstable molecule, and it doesn't get stored in muscle cells, so it's got to be continuously produced. So where do we get it from? We've already kind of talked about how we get it from dietary carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, and we're going to reiterate that here in this chapter as well. But something that we didn't mention yet, there is a substance called phosphocreatine. For short, it's called PCR. And this is going to be a molecule right here. It's a phosphorylated creatine. And so the phosphate comes off and is just donated to ATP. And so for every phosphocreatine, 1 ATP molecule gets produced. So it's not, extremely efficient, but it's going to be there for short-term use. And it is in your muscle cells, and it will be available to keep the activity going for a little bit longer. Okay, so how long? So here it is. So again, the energy source that your cells can use directly is called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. You will find it in all tissues all the time. It is going to be used all the time, but again, there is a limited amount. Not a large amount is stored in those cells, and so you can run out very quickly. There's enough for about 0 to 3 seconds of activity, so sprinting, for example. And then you run out, and your body has to turn to other sources. And so, again, here's phosphocreatine. This works by just donating the phosphate to ADP to form ATP, so regenerating the ATP molecule. Again, you're going to find this in all of the tissues throughout your body. And when is it used? Short bursts. Okay, so your cells will run out of this as well. So when is it used? Again, short bursts of activity like shot put, high jump, bench pressing. Your body will then turn to carbohydrates. So you can use carbohydrates anaerobically. Okay, you have carbohydrates stored in your muscles that can be used for anaerobic respiration. When is this going to be used? High intensity exercises lasting 30 seconds to 2 minutes. So anaerobic respiration can occur for, again, not a large window of time. So when would you use this? Short sprints, like the 200-meter sprint if you're a track runner. Carbohydrates used for aerobic respiration. Again, these are going to generate more ATP. Oxygen has to be present for this. Carbohydrates, in this case, are going to be stored in both the muscles and your liver. Exercise lasting 2 minutes to 3 or more hours. So when your muscle cells run out of carbohydrates, your liver glycogen stores will be broken down. Blood glucose gets taken up by your muscles, and then you will use that. So again, exercise lasting 2 minutes to 3 hours or more. Things like jogging, soccer, basketball, swimming, gardening, car washing. So, moderate intensity exercises. And then fats can also be used. Fats can only be used by aerobic, cannot digest, metabolize fats anaerobically. Fat is stored in muscle cells and in fat cells. When is it used? Exercise lasting more than a few minutes. So again, we'll have carbohydrates and fats being broken down aerobically. Greater amounts are used at lower intensity exercises. As intensity increases, your cells will switch from fats to carbohydrates. Okay, so activity, long distance running, marathons, ultra endurance events, cycling, day-long hikes. We'll be using fat for those. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about each of these. Again, just keeping my paper straight. Again, phosphocreatine. This is the initial source to resupply muscle ATP when muscle ATP is used. Okay, so again, muscle ATP, you only have a few seconds of that. Then we're going to turn to phosphocreatine to resupply ATP. So phosphocreatine is made from ATP and creatine. And again, it's stored in muscle cells. It's a more stable molecule. When adenosine diphosphate starts to accumulate, there will be an enzyme that will transfer a phosphate group from phosphocreatine to ADP to reform ATP. So literally, we just pluck a phosphate group off of creatine and give it to ADP to form ATP. So it's a one-for-one swap. We're not making boatloads of ATP in this process. Phosphocreatine can maintain muscle contractions for about 10 seconds to a minute. Okay, but then after that, it gets depleted. It can be activated instantly, and it can replenish ATP quick enough for fast and powerful actions. Okay, so again, things like the high jump or doing a bench press. But it cannot be sustained for more than a minute or so. Okay, so short term, quick bursts of energy. Okay, so again, this kind of shows it. What happens is phosphocreatine will donate its phosphate to ADP, and you end up with ATP plus creatine, okay, unphosphorylated. And then more of this gets made, okay? So a muscle at rest, not contracting, the phosphocreatine levels will be high, about 5 times greater than ATP concentrations. Active muscle, ATP concentrations, kind of go down. That's going to trigger this reaction. And what will happen is your phosphocreatine levels will fall. Okay. Again, that is to restore ATP levels. So this is kind of going to be your first source to regenerate some ATP. Okay. So then we run out of that. So after phosphocreatine is depleted, and it will be continuously made, but as it gets depleted and as it starts to be depleted, what will happen is carbohydrates are next on deck. Okay, and again, phosphocreatine will be produced and replenished, but not enough to maintain exercise. Okay, so we turn to carbohydrates, and we know that glucose is the primary carbohydrate that's used to generate ATP. Begins to break down during glycolysis. That's the first step of metabolism for glucose. This step happens in the cytoplasm of the cell. It does not require oxygen. So we call this, it's an anaerobic process. Okay. During this process of glycolysis, a small amount of ATP is produced, 2, and 2 molecules of pyruvate. Okay. If oxygen is present, pyruvate goes into the mitochondria, and it's going to be metabolized farther to produce much higher levels of ATP, like around 28 molecules of ATP. Okay, so carbohydrates, they're going to be the major fuel for short-term high intensity and medium intensity, and medium-term, medium intensity exercises. Okay. Okay, so here we go, just showing the 2 pathways here. So here's glucose, which again is stored in muscle cells in the form of glycogen. Glucose can be broken down anaerobically. In that process, it produces 2 molecules of ATP. It also produces lactate. okay? As well as hydrogen ions, which can change the pH in muscles, and we'll talk about cramping and things like that. Or it can be broken down if oxygen is present, and depending on what the intensity of the activity and the length of the activity is, it can be broken down aerobically as well. And where's my pointer? Here we go. Aerobic respiration, again, is going to generate much higher levels of ATP. Okay. Okay. Talk a little bit more about anaerobic respiration. Again, we did this in a couple chapters ago, but just to revisit it. So anaerobic, you're thinking without oxygen. Again, this is just going to be the first stage in respiration, which is glycolysis. This will be used when oxygen supply is limited or physical activity is really intense. You need quick energy. It only supplies 2 molecules of ATP. Carbohydrates are the only fuel that can be used here. Fats cannot be used. This provides most of the energy for events when energy production is near maximal for 30 to 120 seconds. So again, short term. It cannot sustain ATP production for long-term exercises. We're going to have to turn to aerobic pathways. And on average, only 5% of the ATP produced in your muscles from muscle glycogen is going to be released. Okay, so anaerobic is not used, it's not the preferred mode. Okay, it does result in the accumulation of lactate, which is a byproduct of glycolysis, of anaerobic glycolysis. It also produces kind of excess protons, H pluses, hydrogen ions, which does change the pH of our muscles, which is associated with that burning sensation, almost might feel like cramping. It goes away when the exercise is done. But again, that's the onset of fatigue. Okay. So again, if oxygen is not present, that's all we have. When oxygen is present, our cells will prefer to do aerobic respiration. Okay, so when oxygen is present and when the activity is moderate to low intensity. Okay, so high intensity might require anaerobic, but lower to moderate intensity is going to go with aerobic. So the pyruvate produced during glycolysis, it doesn't get turned into lactate. Instead, it gets shuttled into the mitochondria. It gets broken down farther. Again, 95% of ATP production from complete metabolism of glucose is going to be performed aerobically. Okay, so most of the time, aerobic respiration is going to be used by our muscle cells. Okay, this pathway is slower than anaerobic respiration, but look at the difference in the amount of energy produced. So anaerobic respiration, we're only getting 2 ATP generated, where aerobic respiration, we're getting 28 or more ATP produced. So that's a big difference. So aerobic respiration is going to be important when we're doing activities that are lasting a little bit longer. So about 2 minutes to 3 or more hours, we're going to use aerobic respiration. Okay, and just kind of a review, we did this a few chapters ago, but just to let you know that, dietary carbohydrates, dietary fats, and dietary proteins can all feed into this pathway of producing ATP. Dietary carbohydrates are broken down. We end up with a rise in blood glucose levels. Glucose can be used by our bodies, either anaerobically to produce lactate or aerobically, to be broken down completely. Both of those processes will produce ATP. Anaerobic produces only 2 ATP, where aerobic respiration, which includes the electron transport chain, is going to produce a lot more ATP. Excess glucose gets stored as glycogen in both our liver and muscle cells. And then dietary fats, we know, can also be broken down and can enter into aerobic respiration. They can also be stored. And then dietary proteins, preferred, would be used to form body cells, but they can also the amino acids can enter the bloodstream. They can be deaminated, so this NH3 group comes off, and this is going to, add to urine. And then the carbon skeleton can enter into aerobic respiration this way. It's not preferred to break down dietary protein for energy. The preferred sources are carbohydrates and fats. But if your body has to, it will turn to proteins. Okay. Briefly want to talk about muscle glycogen versus blood glucose for fuel, and just kind of point out some differences here. So we've talked about this already. Glycogen is the way that our body stores glucose, and glycogen stores can be found in our muscle cells as well as in our liver. Okay, liver glycogen will be broken down to maintain blood glucose levels. When blood glucose levels are high, glucose will be shuttled to the liver where glycogen will be made. Okay, muscle glycogen supplies glucose to the muscle, and it's used for short events. Okay, so muscle glycogen gets used by the muscle, it doesn't leave. Liver glycogen is used to resupply blood glucose levels. So there's a difference there. When muscle glycogen declines, so when you're using glucose, when you're exercising and your muscles are using glucose, the muscles will then have to take up blood glucose from your bloodstream for energy. And so that's going to require the breakdown of glycogen from your liver. Okay. When glycogen stores are exhausted, a person can only work at 50% maximum capacity, and we call that hitting the wall. Okay, so if an activity lasts for more than an hour, if you're planning to do an activity like hiking, let's say, for example, where you're going to be out hiking for a couple of hours, you should consider increasing muscle glycogen levels. And to do that, you can do something called carb loading. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so we said ATP is the energy that your cells can use directly, your muscle cells can use directly for movement. When ATP runs out, which is in just a few seconds, your cells will turn to phosphocreatine, which is stored in muscle cells, and you've got a little bit more time. When that runs out, your body will turn to carbohydrates and may have to do anaerobic respiration for short bursts of energy, or aerobic respiration for moderate to low intensity activity, again, to supply ATP. That's what we're doing here. Okay. Carbohydrates are stored in muscle cells in the form of glycogen, and carbohydrates are stored in the liver, again, in the form of glycogen. And so your muscle cells will use muscle glycogen and then will use blood glucose. When those run out, again, there's that hitting the wall. Okay, so when you're doing longer activities, you need to think about carbohydrates. Fats. Okay, so your body will also use fats when you are doing low intensity, low to moderate intensity activities, and also when you're at rest. Okay, your body's going to turn to fat. Okay, so we talked about triglycerides, right? These are fats. They can be broken down and metabolized to generate ATP, just like carbohydrates can. They are a very abundant energy source, even in individuals who don't have a lot of body fat, so lean people. They provide more than twice the amount of energy per gram as carbohydrates. Remember, there's all of the carbon to carbon bonds, and there's lots of energy in there. Okay, the longer the fatty acid, the more energy it can produce. Fats will be your main fuel source during low intensity exercises, and also exercises that last a long time, so long duration. When we are at rest, fat is our predominant fuel source, and again, during prolonged low to moderate activities. The rate of fatty acid use by our bodies, by our cells, is affected by training. The more trained, the greater the ability a muscle can use fat as fuel. Training increases the size and number of mitochondria in our muscle cells. It increases the level of enzymes that are involved in aerobic respiration in that pathway. and it also increases the amount of muscle myoglobin, which plays a role in oxygen storage in muscle cells. Okay, so both carbohydrates and fats can both be used, again, as energy sources for the production of ATP. Carbohydrates are going to be used mostly for moderate to high intensity activities, where fats are used usually for moderate to low intensity activities. Fats are not metabolized as efficiently as carbohydrates, although they do supply more energy. They also cannot support intense activity because that's anaerobic, and so carbohydrates would be used for that. And they cannot be broken down fast enough to meet ATP demands of short duration, high intensity activities. So again, the first line is phosphocreatine, second is going to be carbohydrates being broken down by anaerobic respiration, and then we have aerobic respiration of carbs and fats. Okay, so again, just to show you energy yield from glucose during aerobic respiration, again, we're going to get around 30 to 32 ATP molecules produced. For fatty acids, if you have a 16 carbon chain fatty acid, that's the length, right? Sometimes they're shorter, sometimes they're longer. You can get from a 16 carbon fatty acid, you can get 106 ATP. So again, a boatload more ATP produced. Okay, it just takes a little bit longer to break those down. And so this is just going to show you how fuels change, talking about just carbohydrates and fats, depending on intensity. So, at rest, fats are going to be the primary. Carbohydrates are also broken down, but we say fats are the primary because they're broken down at a higher percentage. And then as the intensity of activity increases, so when we get to like a moderate, intense, maximum, there's going to be a switch from fats to carbohydrates because you need energy faster. Carbohydrates are broken down a little bit faster. And again, when we get up here, this might be anaerobic respiration, which fats just can't be used for. Okay. Okay. And so, walking, you're going to use fats and carbs, probably more fats than carbs. As you increase intensity, maybe weightlifting, there's a little bit of a shift, a little bit more carbs are used. A 2-hour run, maybe half and half. Hard cycling for an hour, now you're going to use more carbs than fats. Basketball, fast-paced basketball, again, more carbs than fats. 100-meter hurdle, where you need these short bursts of energy, much more carbs than fats. And again, some of this may be anaerobic when you get into this high intensity. How about protein? So most of the energy is mostly supplied by fats and carbohydrates. We will turn to protein. Most of the energy supplied from protein comes from the metabolism of what are called branched chain amino acids. So they have longer functional groups, or R groups, side chains, okay? Again, proteins can be deaminated, so the amino group can come off, and that carbon skeleton can be used to make glucose or acetyl-CoA, so it can enter the citric acid cycle. The contribution of proteins is extremely small. Less than 5% of energy comes from amino acids. If you're an endurance athlete, that number can be a little bit higher. It's barely amino acids are barely used at all in resistance exercises. So again, they're going to contribute a very small amount, if any, to activity. Okay, and I just wanted to mention VO2 max along with fuel kind of one more time. So again, fuel sources for cells, we've got muscle glycogen, muscle fat, blood glucose, free fatty acids in the bloodstream. So again, carbohydrates, fats. Fuel sources for cells can be established based off of the percent VO2 max. And so fat use drops as intensity increases. We just saw that in the previous slide. And in very high intensity activities, ATP is going to be produced anaerobically from phosphocreatine and from carbohydrates, from glycolysis. Okay, so VO2 max is my pointer. Low intensity, like golf, is not a very high intensity activity. Low intensity, fast walking, golf, you know, brisk walk, okay, falls into that category. I can't think of anything else right now. Your VO2 max will be a low. It'll be at about 30 to 50%. In this case, you know, you are going to be using mostly fats. So muscle triglycerides, 20%, free fatty acids in the bloodstream, 70%, some muscle glycogen, some blood glucose. As you increase intensity, so fast jog, or in this case, playing soccer, which that could be high intensity as well, your VO2 max will increase, you know, from 30 to 50 to 50 to 65%. And there will be a shift in what you're using. So again, you're going to be using more muscle glycogen, more blood glucose than you were, and you know, maybe more muscle triglycerides and a lower number of free fatty acids from the blood. As intensity increases even higher, so 3-hour marathon, your VO2 max will go up to 70 to 80%. And again, your muscle glycogen that you're using and your blood glucose that you're using go up, and the amount of fat that you're using goes down. As you get very intense, VO2 max 85 to 150, for example, sprints, your amount of glycogen goes up. Okay, and again, this is probably going to be anaerobic respiration, and the amount of fat being used, you know, goes down again. Okay, and that is the last slide of 11.3. We'll save 11.4 for the next video.